go ahead and begin. So I really like this painting or an etching of London in the early 1700s, because this is just before, sorry, this is just after the Great Fire of London in 1666, well, a few decades afterwards, when a lot of the deserted, burnt out streets of the city, which is this area here, the City of London, was rebuilt in red brick. So for a few decades in the early 1700s, London had this rosy pink hue, and people were very proud of this new city. And it actually became one of the foremost cities in Europe because of its modern buildings, of a more structurally sound buildings after this really tragic fire, which is quite an interesting little nugget of history there. So the 1700s was a huge boom time. There was an enormous diversification of trade, for example, with new aspects of British society like the Bank of England, new ways of investing in companies, of using your money and multiplying it in a trade system that was full of new possibilities, where the ordinary man, for example, could get rich. He could become a nobleman, for example, or part of the aristocracy much more easily than before. So it was an era in which, in one sense, the social class started to fall apart, but in another sense, it also became much more acutely strong. So the higher upper classes, they were aware of trying to keep the lower classes in check, but also needing them to be able to do the work which would allow them to make their own money. So it was this strange time, almost like a city of extremes, when you get an increased possibility for the ordinary man, but you also then see these enormous differences in wealth, when hundreds of thousands of people came from all over the country and abroad to live in this city of possibilities. It's very interesting that the city area of Southwark, which is here, so London in the 1700s wasn't just this whole area. There were three separately authorized regions, which was the city around this area, Westminster over here, and then Southwark, which was here. They were three different areas. And Southwark was actually the second biggest city. If it were a standalone settlement, it would have been the second biggest city in England at the time. The whole population of this area by the end of the 1700s had gone from a few 100,000, maybe something like 200 or 300,000, up to about 800,000 people. The second biggest city, the end of the 1700s, was Bristol, which had a population of about 30,000. Just to give you a sense of how absolutely enormous this city was. You had a huge increase in the government's role. There was a huge amount of new governmental power, able to support the needs of the people or the clamors of the people. There were more and more clamors of the people to get rights, to get the streets fixed, to get better building quality, to get more and more rights. And there were just so many new jobs. There was the shipping industry, there was the nobility industry, all of these rich houses needing many, many servants. There was obviously a huge demand for food and for luxury goods, with all of these wealthy people coming there. So it was a huge boom time compared to the 15 and 1600s. An aerial view here from the early 1700s showing the extent of the whole area of London. And another map here from the mid 1700s showing that London was expanding quite drastically. This whole area here in the West End that you can see is quite undeveloped here, expanding massively. So the West End over here was largely an area for the more affluent classes, because the wind would actually blow this way largely. So all of the pollution from the fires and the chimneys of central London would blow over this way. And so this was part of the reason for this being the fashionable area for the wealthy, but also because of its proximity down here in Westminster to the Houses of Parliament and to the royalty. So ever since William the Conqueror 1,000 years ago, this was the base for the English monarchy, and still is to this day, with Buckingham Palace, for example, just being here, Houses of Parliament here, and St. James's Palace, so 3 very important royal institutions. I wanted to start with something kind of fun before we get into other topics which aren't so fun, which was the first ever circus. So public entertainments have, of course, existed for thousands of years, but under one horseman called Philip Astley, he brought together a whole troupe of different performers gradually over time and made something called Astleys Circus, which was just across the river from Westminster in Lambeth. And it's known as the first ever proper circus, where you have all kinds of different performances, as well as clowns and other performers and jugglers to fill in the gaps between these performances. And this was first set up in the 1770s. Philip Astley was a military man originally, and within the military, he saw that people loved trick riding, people who would do tricks on horses. And he loved riding. He was a very, very skilled horseman. And so he had this idea to create a business out of this, to draw crowds to this kind of spectacle. And it was really quite incredible. In the 1770s, there were all kinds of things going on in this one show. There was a monkey, for example, that was trained to walk across a tightrope and smoke a pipe, amongst other things. There was a guy, Mr. Ducrot, who would stand on a horse that was decked out like a fighting galleon at sea and do all kinds of performances while on this running horse. Philip Astley himself would do a trick where he would stand on his head and fire a pistol while the horse was galloping at full trot. So he was an incredibly skilled performer as well as a skilled equestrian. And it was talked about in later generations, this circus, as one of the peak attractions of London in the late 1700s. It was just over here. He started out actually in these fields, which are now, of course, part of London, but used to be kind of open fields. And there's still a plaque there, which is that Philip Astley first staged this modern day, what we would call a modern day circus in this area. A different kind of showdown, if you like, was dueling. So dueling was very common relatively, so amongst usually the higher classes of society in the 1700s and also in the 1800s. It starts to peter out in the mid 1800s. So in the early 1700s, it was done by swords because pistols weren't really a thing. And actually the dueling by sword was much more fatal than with pistols. So quite a high percentage of men died by dueling with sword, but they didn't die dueling with a pistol as much. Only a very small fraction did. It was technically illegal, but a lot of the time the cases were deemed not guilty in court. Often these people were quite high-ranking members of the society, so there was a lot of power play in it. And dueling arose out of needing to settle your pride. If someone slandered you or slandered your partner or slandered someone who you loved or tried to get the woman that you loved unfairly, then you could challenge them to a duel. There was one famous case like this about a woman between James Hamilton and Charles Mohun in the early 1700s when they met at the Ring in Hyde Park, and they actually both died from their wounds. Yeah. The pistols in dueling came into about 1760. Pistols started to be used. And I wanted to use this example here from 1783, where there's actually a letter written starting this duel between Cosmo Gordon and Colonel Thomas. And this was a struggle over a woman. And this is the letter to Colonel Thomas. Sir, having had a full and honourable acquittal of the charge you brought against me, I desire you will give me personal satisfaction and meet me with a friend and 2 brace of pistols and a sword at the Ring in Hyde Park. Your injured, obedient servant, Cosmo Gordon. So still surprisingly polite and formal for basically a death challenge. So outside of the law, this was quite an effective way, of course, relatively, for people to actually get their justice done. You couldn't really take someone to court for just saying that your girlfriend was being too upfront with me or with someone else, or some slight that you made to them. So it could be incredibly personal. You can't take incredibly personal things to court so easily. So this was seen by the government, kind of a blind eye towards it, because it was seen as quite an effective way of settling these issues. You would go out, and as I said before, a lot of the time with pistols, they weren't actually killed. They were just slightly wounded or more seriously wounded, but not fatal. And that was then the end of it. It was first blood or incapacitation. And there was a whole culture within this, how it should be done, that you would bring a friend. Each of these men would bring a friend with you, and there would be a referee. So it was a whole thing. One huge development in London in the sort of 1660s and then still to this day are coffee shops. They came across originally from the Middle East with this arising of trade in the 1600s. And they really took off in the late 1600s and the early 1700s as a principal place for people to meet and to do business and to talk, to share ideas. They would use it to get their post delivered to there. It was basically a second home or a modern day office space. And many of these coffee houses became very famous for starting whole business ideas. For example, Jonathan's Coffee House, just next to the Royal Exchange in London, which was a principal meeting place of merchants. Merchants were people in the day who were doing business overseas. And at Jonathan's Coffee House, for example, the stockbrokers would meet, and then that's where they started the London Stock Exchange. This is a painting from inside of Lloyd's Coffee House, where what arose was the actual owner of the coffee house in the early 1700s, Mr. Lloyd. He had the good sense to make a little pamphlet, the News of Lloyd's, which was all about shipping news. And what arose in Lloyd's Coffee House was an insurance market, where you had a series of people who would then give someone their risk. So someone would come to them and say, I have a ship that I'm going to send to China to bring back tea. We're going to send over wool or whatever it was. And then this underwriter would then write the risk that these people were taking and how much that they could be insured from. So this was the beginning of this insurance market in London. And if you know Lloyd's of London, it's still one of the most prominent insurance floors in the world. It's not really a separate company. It's a whole series of people who use that space to provide insurance. And in the 1700s, British insurance became quite famous in Europe and around the world as something of quite a high quality, and a high degree of trust was involved in it. There were hundreds of coffee houses, I think 200 and something coffee houses in the city of London in the 1700s alone, in a small, 1 square mile area. And it was a seriously important breeding ground for new companies, new ideas. Another view inside Lloyd's of London. Quite amazingly, the original building, which was built in the late 1600s, actually survives, parts of it, and sometimes it gets put on display in different galleries and museums in London. So the original opening you can still see to Lloyd's of London in certain places, but it's not always on display, unfortunately. So these wealthy middle and upper class men who were frequenting these coffee shops, they weren't always on the best behavior. And actually it became not fashionable as such, but it became a tendency to want to outlet things that were deemed immoral in the society and to do them in a more protective environment. One aspect of that was gambling, which I'll get onto in a second. So this is quite a famous painting by William Hogarth, A Rake's Progress, a tavern scene. It's from 1734. And a rake was someone who burned through family money or through some kind of inheritance, was basically a libertine or a cad, someone who was irrespectable, but lived life, you know, burnt the candle at both ends. So there was something in a way quite romantic about it for the people doing it, that it was some kind of opposition to expectations of society, when actually they had the means and the apparent freedom to go and do whatever they wanted. This is a pretty debaucherous scene from the Rose Tavern, which was in near Covent Garden, which was a very prominent area for prostitution and for late night bars. It was very near to Drury Lane, which was the theatre district in the 1700s in London, and actually still is today. For example, all of these ladies of the night, they have these black spots on their faces, which were black spots to cover up sexually transmitted sores and other kinds of diseases. And the main character, this rake, going through the series of paintings are different paintings from this guy's progress from his early years of being trained up to going through all of this debauchery. This is a roughly contemporaneous view of that area, showing kind of what the outside of the Rose Inn may have looked like. So the gambling aspect, one of the most famous gentlemen's clubs was White's Club in St. James's. So St. James's was an area right by St. James's Palace, which became a very prominent palace in the 1600s, especially under Charles II and Charles I. And as a result of that, a very wealthy area grew up around it. And actually today, it's still one of the most expensive areas to live and shop in London. And White's Club used to be, in the 1600s, it was a chocolate shop called White's Chocolate Shop, where you could go and drink hot chocolate, for example, and socialize. And out of that arose a gentleman's club, which then became known as White's. And it still exists to this day. Here it is. I'll get back to that in a sec, just to show you, this is the area of St. James's, around St. James's Park and St. James's Palace, which is just here. So this area was one of the wealthiest areas of London. So White's still exists. Prince Charles, for example, is a member. This is actually where he had his stag do before marrying Princess Diana. And it has some very wealthy and influential people as its members. But one thing that they became very famous for was gambling. And gambling, of course, is a very old, 1,000-year-old human tendency. But there's a very interesting connection between the rise of things like the stock market in England at around this time. And there's been some interesting speculation that this love of gambling with all different classes within English society was part of what fueled the stock market, was this sense of you're gambling, you're taking a risk. And yeah, there's a whole talk in itself, I guess, but I think it's quite an interesting aspect of the relationship between this gambling, kind of reckless, risk-taking character and the stock market. This is The Hazard Room by Thomas Rowlandson, who was a prominent Georgian era cartoonist and painter who did loads of these kinds of debauched, warped scenes from London life. Hazard was a game where you would roll dice and you would bet upon the different outcome of the dice. So it wasn't just a random game of luck. You had to actually use your brain. You had to be engaged in it. You had to be intelligent. You had to be good at it to be able to do it. And it became very popular with the upper classes. Games like different card games like whist, for example, they were also quite more upper class games. So it wasn't just random gambling all the time, but there was random gambling. There are stories, for example, in White's gambling book. So White's has a record going back to the early 1700s of all of the bets that were placed. And some of the bets were, for example, I bet my friend won't have sex in a hot air balloon within a few years. This was in the 1760s. Or a bet of which drop of water would reach the bottom of the pane of glass first, where they were sitting and watching. So this aspect of betting was somehow seen as very fashionable. This recklessness or ease with which you could bet all of this money, you know, this show of how wealthy you were, was hugely important in the 1700s. Another view of it here. One quite interesting story is the Earl of Sandwich, who was a prominent gambler, but also very much involved in the politics of the Navy and the nation as a whole. And one of the stories is that when he was gambling, he would often gamble for many hours at a time. This was quite common, that these aristocrats who didn't necessarily have much else to do would just spend their time gambling. And because he wasn't eating, he then said, right, bring me a piece of meat with some bread around it. And that's what he would then eat, sort of one meal all in one quick go with his hands. And that this was the origin of the sandwich. That's not known to be 100% true, but his biographer said that if it were true that the sandwich was named after him, it's probably more likely that this was what he was eating while he was working at his office, because he was actually quite a very busy man. But it's an interesting little history of the origin of the word sandwich there. And it could get pretty raucous. And I'm painting perhaps a genteel picture of the upper classes, but within the upper classes, both with dueling, but also in the middle and lower classes, there was a huge amount of violence. There wasn't a police force, for example, in London until the 1820s. So yeah, there was a huge problem with that. One sort of sub-genre of this gentleman's club world was something called the Hellfire Club. The Hellfire Club were a group of gentlemen who joined up into these clubs in London and also outside of London to take it one step further. So in this age of enlightenment, there was, in some areas, there was a ridiculing of religion, of these old traditions of religious rites. So a couple of quotes about them. One thing that was said was that they did obscene parodies of religious rites. So here you can see these guys dressed up as witches, and it says here, bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, this sort of classical witch thing. And Horace Walpole in the 1700s said that they would eat different meals in their clubs, things like Holy Ghost pie, breast of Venus, devil's loin, while drinking hellfire punch. So they did these decidedly pagan rituals, even sacrificing animals to these old Greco-Roman gods. And they would also be drinking a lot, and there were women of the night there in abundance. And one of the places they became known was Brooks's Club, which was another very famous gentleman's club from the 1700s. Here it's still surviving in London, in St. James's. Again, still existing as a club. One character is Beau Brummel, who used to sit in this window space here. This was his pride of place. So this is a bit cheating because this is in the early 1800s, in the Regency period, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's really interesting. So he would sit in this arched window with his friends, and he would look at the passers-by and make comments about their fashion. And he redeveloped English fashion tastes, and it became enormously influential. He became a kind of fashion guru for all of the high class people of the society, even people like George IV and all kinds of sort of aristocratic influential people at the time. He became their private fashion guru. And George IV, for example, would go and watch him in his room as he prepared. So he would apparently spend hours every day getting his outer appearance ready. And a very interesting aspect, this is the thing I wanted to mention, was that from this Georgian 1700s style, which was very colorful, very gold laced, full of all different kinds of things, and with these stockings and breeches coming up here, that what Beau Brummel did was to refine it greatly, was to take a kind of military curtness about a uniform and to make it into something fashionable, including trousers that go right down to the ankle. And when you look at modern day suits, they owe an enormous amount to this change in fashion in the early 1800s from Beau Brummel. So I just find that an interesting little thing to add in there. And talking of interesting characters, another one is Henry Cavendish, who was insanely wealthy and lived in London, roughly the area of Mayfair and Bloomsbury today. He was intensely shy as well. So in his house in Mayfair, he had a separate staircase leading up behind the house so that he wouldn't have to be seen by his house servants. He never wanted to be seen by his house servants. He never wanted to see them, especially the women. He had an intense reservedness about women, and he would leave notes around the house to give them particular instructions. He used to hang out at the Royal Society, so he was a very, very intelligent, diligent scientist. But apparently, if you would try to talk to him, he would just sort of give a squeak and walk off. Suddenly, he wouldn't be there. So he was intensely shy, but he was fascinated by science. And later on in his life, he bought a house in Clapham, which is in the south of London. And this became known as the house where the whole earth was weighed, because he actually came up with an experiment in the grounds of this house, which doesn't exist anymore, which was a way to measure the density of the earth, where he took 2 larger lead balls and 2 smaller lead balls either side of them, and with an incredibly sensitive array of equipment in a room that he specially designed to be as pure from distractions and distortions as possible. He measured the gravitational pull between these 2 objects. And from that, he actually then determined the density of the Earth. He did this by looking in through these telescopes either side, which you can see in this recreation here. And actually, the density of the Earth his calculations are within 1% accuracy of today's established measurements, which is quite incredible that he did that from this little box with these lead balls. His discoveries also contributed to the fact that the Earth has an inner core of metal. They knew at this time, for example, in the 1760s, 1770s, that the outer crust of the Earth was lighter than what was in the middle. So the fact that Cavendish then came out with these calculations about how dense the Earth was, they reasoned that there must be something much, much denser inside the Earth than just this crust of soil. He also discovered hydrogen. Of course, he didn't discover it, but he sort of isolated it. He called it inflammable air. And then the chemist Lavoisier, a few decades later, then used Cavendish's research and then called it hydrogen. Another quite unique character, but not as famous, is Thomas Britton. So I'd be surprised if you've heard of him. But there's a plaque in Clerkenwell, just northwest of the city of London, near to Smithfield. He was a coal merchant, and above his house in Clerkenwell, he had a kind of storage space where he would store the coal. But he was a very keen musician. And what he did was to bring in various musical instruments, and he would bring in musicians to play. And this was in the early 1700s, where it's kind of one of the first sort of indie concert venues, if you like, in London. And among those people, it seems that also Handel, the famous German musician who lived in London for many, many years, would have played up in this little loft as well, which is quite amazing to actually go to that site. This is just a recreation of a room with an old piano in it, but the actual site still exists. It's Jerusalem Passage in Clerkenwell, where this little plaque is. Unfortunately, this guy met a bit of a strange ending. He was a very, superstitious religious man. And one of his friends played a joke on him by hiring a ventriloquist to sit in the room where a performance was being done and to say, "Thomas, your end is nigh." And Thomas Britton got so scared that he fell down on his knees and begged forgiveness to God, to the voice of God. And then he actually had a heart attack and died from this shock and surprise. So a bit of a sad ending to that story, but anyway. So towards the end of the 1700s, you get the first glimpses of the Industrial Revolution. And this is the first purpose-built factory. So an intense mechanized process of processing cotton, I believe it was cotton or wool. The Albion Mills in Southwark, just south of the city of London on the other side of the river. And this had a whole series of engines, and it was quite a wonder. So the current the Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1700s, the Duke of Milan, he actually came as a purpose visit to London to look at this mill. And for a few years, it dominated the British wool trade. It was able to process garments at such an increased pace, but it burnt down only a few years later. What's quite funny about that is that when it was opened, it drew huge crowds. You know, people were fascinated by these new ventures like Philip Astleys Circus and all of this variety of new entertainments and wonders. And it drew a huge crowd to see it. But it also drew a huge crowd to watch it burn down. They were in a way equally, if not more, fascinated. And there were mixed opinions and feelings about factories. People didn't like the sense of the factory being a place where workers would go in and become like machines, and that the farm hand's work would be taken away from him by these new factories. It was a divided opinion, of course. And the burning down of this this factory only a few years after it was built is a potential influence for the first half of William Blake's poem, Jerusalem. And did those feet in ancient time walk up on England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? So one aspect of that, the dark satanic mills, could have been this mill here, where William Blake lived very close by to it when it was burning down. The area of Smithfield I find really fascinating. This was on the northwest corner of the city of London, and it was a very ancient throughway where cattle would be brought down through the north of London into the city. And Smithfield, for about 1,000 years, has been a meat market. It still is. There is still a big meat market there, but it's all indoors. and it's soon going to be moved somewhere else. But before it was indoors, it was a huge outdoor market. All of these pens that you can see here are sheep, and all of these things, cows around here. It was also a place to buy horses. So this was apparently a very disgusting place to be in a way, because there was this constant screaming of the animals who were being slaughtered, and the smell of all of the guts and the excrement was apparently overwhelming. It was a huge sort of cacophony of blood and guts and shouting and screaming and dying animals. Very different from today, where it's much more, yeah, nothing really happens in there that's so dark and disturbing as that. But a bit of a darker tale from it is the selling of wives. So I am aware that I've been talking a lot about the gentlemen of the society, but I will try and bring in women as well. But unfortunately, there aren't that many cases of, you know, happy women's lives that are recorded. So the selling of wives was quite a prominent, commonplace thing, even up until the mid-1800s. A bit like dueling, there was quite a good reason to allow it to keep going on. It was a way to resolve issues that the courts couldn't do so easily, especially if you were in the lower class of the English society, which were the people who did sell their wives, who couldn't afford a divorce. A divorce could be a couple of years' wages for these poorer people. And so there are recorded instances, for example, of the woman wanting to be sold as a way to get out of this unhappy marriage. Or just between them, it was obvious that they needed to separate. They were completely, this wasn't working, but they couldn't get an official divorce. And so they would sell their wives, and perhaps in a pub, and there would be a small payment and a drink given to the person selling the wife. And this is a quote from the Times in 1797. I'll try and move this thing here. I can't do it. On Friday, a butcher exposed his wife to sale in Smithfield Market, near the Ram Inn, with a halter about her neck and one about her waist, which tied her to a railing, when a hog driver was the happy purchaser, who gave the husband 3 guineas and a crown for his departed rib. Pity it is, but there is no stop put to such depraved conduct in the lower order of people. Quite amazing that even 200 years ago, there were still wives being sold in Smithfield Market. Another mention of that in a British newspaper. And it was deemed so diabolical that the French cartoons ridiculed the English practice of selling a wife. A little bit about women's fashion. There's often the feeling, especially in the Victorian age, that if women showed an ankle or any bit of flesh, that it was seen as really taboo. There's not really any proper evidence of that. And in the Georgian era, in the 1700s, it actually seems to be in a way quite the opposite. They didn't show a lot of flesh just anyway, although the chest area was often quite open. But the way that the dresses were done accentuated these various aspects, like big hips, a big behind, and a busty chest. And they had these massive hairdos with these big hats full of flowers and feathers, all kinds of regalia. So actually it seems to have been quite a sexualized fashion, especially in its extremes, with these huge like bums and hips. Oops, sorry. This is a more elegant French version with this hat and the quite piled up hairstyle. There are funny parodies of this French extreme with a servant actually having to hold up the woman's hairstyle and hat because it's so large and heavy. And part of this show, this increase in this showiness, both in men and women, was the season, which was roughly a period with the opening of Parliament around January up until the end of, or the middle of summer, like July, August, when the wealthy people in the countryside would come in from their country retreats and socialize, look for a partner, make connections, political, social connections. This is a parody of that from the 1800s, showing the women preparing for the season with a couple of funny things like the engines of war with their clips and their hairbrushes, and this dowager looking at a magazine of potential husbands. This is a caricature of how much these women's clothes were sexualized, with the inconvenience. So this huge chest and bum and this enormous hairstyle. So these poor women, I guess not always, but with this, the extremes of this fashion. This is just a funny instance of this, the cheekiness of the 1700s. There was a building called Somerset House, which still exists. And there was the Royal Academy, which was an art gallery, used to be based there. And there was this staircase, this winding, narrow staircase that would go up, where there were places that you could stop. And in the early days, there used to be men who would hang out there, and in the hope that some of the women would actually fall so that their dresses would ride up. And as a way to combat this, they made people buy a catalogue in order to actually come in and look at the art. Part of women's fashion at the time was to have very prominent eyebrows, bushy, dark, seductive eyebrows. Of course, if you didn't have those naturally, even if you had them naturally, they would often be shaved off, and mouse fur would be cut out and worn on the eyebrows. So this is an example of a French woman with these mouse fur eyebrows, and the historian Lucy Wolseley showing an example of that with this mouse fur on the eyebrows. So pretty strange times. Out in the area of Westminster, there's this little tiny area called Craig's Court, where a aristocrat built this house in the early 1700s to be close to the Houses of Parliament and to the royalty. And in this court, there was a very scandalous book written by Teresa Phillips, an apology for her conduct. And it was a series of books that were published in London, which started off as her apologizing for her various affairs that she had had with other men and a quick succession of marriages. But then the books became a celebration of that, and they became a celebration of her, in a way, sort of emancipating herself and saying, I wanted to do these things and I did them, and this is it in all of its details. And it was very, very scandalous. But she then went to Jamaica, a British colony, and actually got one of the first government jobs for a woman, which was in charge of certain areas of festivities. And so she actually became quite a prominent government figure in her own right, but not in London anymore. Another instance from Craig's Court, which I find really interesting because it's this tiny little square and a tiny little street just off from Westminster, from Trafalgar Square. So you always see people, huge streams of travelers and tourists walking past it, but no one really goes up in there or knows about the history. So in the 1700s, and of course before in London's history, there were no pavements or sidewalks. There was no easy way for the pedestrian to avoid the carriages, and, you know, very dangerous. Many people got run over or mutilated or injured from just not being able to get out of the way of a horse and carriage in this press of vehicles. And so there was a lot of debate going on in the Houses of Parliament about how to deal with this. And if there were to be pavements or sidewalks, who should pay for them? It's very expensive to pave the entire streets of London. There's an interesting story which is documented, but it's not sure how, how final it was in starting the paving of London. But the Speaker of the House, Arthur Onslow, was visiting his friend at Craig's Court. And I'll go back to the image, going down this little alleyway here where there were no pavements and the buildings were even closer together. And his carriage, horse and carriage, this is about 1750, got stuck. It got jammed in these walls, in between these walls. And he had to be cut out and dragged out of the carriage. And then he actually went back to the House of Commons, and he was much more actively engaged in pushing through this new law to have pavements, where every householder had to put some money forwards to paving the area outside their property. So this was one way of trying to pay for it. And actually these pavements then became quite a prominent example for other cities around Europe at the time. As far as I'm aware, London was one of the first places to do it. So yeah, wanted to sort of close off with something about Tyneburn. So Tyneburn Tree was this area where people were hung. It wasn't actually a tree, it was a gallows that was built. It was over here, outside in the west of London, just near today where Hyde Park begins, going along next to the River Tyburn here. The first recorded hanging is about 1190, and these hangings went right up until 1798 in this place around here, these public executions. They got stopped because there was such a huge amount of people coming to watch them, and they became so raucous and so out of control that then executions still happened, but they happened inside Newgate Prison, which is just down here in the city of London. So if you were to be hanged, you would be taken from Newgate Prison around here, and you would have this one last journey along here and then down Oxford Street to Tyburn to be hung. And along the way, you expected to stop at various places and have a drink. So often the people who were hung, they were so drunk by the time that they were actually hung that they were almost completely incapacitated. And obviously you would want to be so drunk that you didn't feel it so acutely. It seems to be where the saying "one for the road," to have one for the road, came from. And also potentially the phrase "to have a hangover," because for the people watching these things, it was such a day of festivities. It was actually a free day, almost like a holiday. People would get obviously really hammered and really drunk and have a huge party with the hanging as the highlight of their day. And then the next day would be a hangover. Part of the spectacle was often these people were real celebrities who were being hung. And also they would make speeches, sometimes, not always, before they died. And these speeches could be hilariously funny, or they could be just particularly powerful or poignant. So this was part of the spectacle too, not just the actual hanging itself. I'll get to some of those celebrities in a sec, but this is the site today. So Hyde Park just over here on the right. And all that's left of it is just these 3 trees and then this plaque saying the site of Tyneburn Tree. One of the celebrities was Jack Sheppard, who was hung in the early 1700s. He's famous for escaping 4 times from prisons. He was only sort of 18 to 22 when he was actually involved in the criminal world in London, a lot around Covent Garden and Drury Lane. And he was imprisoned in 4 different prisons at 4 different times and kept on escaping. And the first time he escaped, he was with his girlfriend, and he broke him and her out of the prison, and then they ran off together. So he became hugely romanticized, and women were screaming at him and crying in the streets when he was being taken down this, one for the road path to be hung. And he was incredibly, incredibly popular. In fact, the painter James Thornhill actually did this engraving of him while he was in prison. His last time at Newgate prison, he was just watched for the whole time, so he couldn't escape. But again, it's a great story to read into if you want to, about how he escaped and his life. So he was only 22 when he was finally hung. So yeah, a couple of these quotes here, and these are scenes from Jack Sheppard's progress. Actually, he was so well loved that some of his friends actually planned to try and revive him after he had been hung. There were cases where people didn't actually completely die, but they went unconscious and then you could revive them. And they planned to do that. But he was so loved by the crowd. Some 200,000 people came to watch him be hung. That's like a third of the population of London at the time, which is pretty incredible. They were so sad to see him die that they all pulled on his feet while he was being hung to try and lessen the time of his suffering. So actually they perhaps, properly killed him. And this is a quote from Jonathan Swift about a guy called Tom Clinch, who was executed earlier on in the 1700s. So just to give a sense of this last progress down the road. As clever Tom Clinch, while the rabble was bawling, rode stately through Holborn to die in his calling. He stopped at the George for a bottle of sack, which is wine, and promised to pay for it when he had come back. The maids to the doors and the balconies ran, and said, "Lack-a-day, he's a proper young man." But as from the windows the ladies he spied, like a bow in the box, he bowed low on each side. To end, as I began, on a more positive note, there, very close to Tyburn, is a building called Tyneburn Convent, which was founded in the early 1900s by a Catholic woman to be a convent for nuns to live in 100% of the time. So unless the nuns have serious medical issues or there's some other urgent thing, they never leave this building. They devote themselves to spend their entire life in this building near Tyburn Tree to pray for Catholics who were killed during the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s at Tyburn. It's quite incredible. I didn't really know this until recently, and it's still going on. These nuns still live in this little collection of buildings, and they're praying constantly. So there's always someone praying. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's always prayers going on in this building for these Catholic martyrs that were killed. And recently, one of the bombings in London, someone wrote to them and said, "Thank you for your prayers. I can still feel them." So I'm not a particularly religious guy, in a kind of Christian sense, but I find it quite a lovely thing that that's still going on, because this was the role of monasteries in England before the 1500s, where these monks and nuns would be praying for the well-being of the society and for the king, for example. So I think it's quite a lovely thing that this is still going on in this one little area next to Tyburn. So yes, various snippets of London in the 1700s. It's a huge area. There's so much to study and to be interested in. But that was a collection of things that I found interesting and hopefully interesting for you too. So thank you.